Picture a small tea shop owner, well past 60, opening his shutters at the exact same minute every single morning the way he has for 40 years. No motivation playlist, no morning pep talk in the mirror. He simply does the thing, the same way, every day, without needing to feel like it first. Meanwhile, most of us spend half our lives waiting to feel ready before we do anything hard, waiting for motivation that never quite shows up on schedule. If you're over 40, you know this feeling well. The gap between who you want to be and what you actually do most days. The frustrated relationship with discipline, either forcing yourself through sheer willpower until you burn out, or giving up entirely and calling it not being a disciplined person. Neither one ever seems to stick. Here's the myth bust. You'd think discipline requires more willpower, more motivation, more hustle to push through resistance. But watch people who've built genuinely disciplined, contented lives, many of them in Japan well into their later decades, and you'll notice something almost boring about how they do it. They're not white-knuckling their way through anything. They've simply stopped relying on motivation altogether and built something steadier in its place. Researchers studying habit and behavior change have found that motivation is one of the least reliable forces we have. It rises and falls with sleep, mood, and stress, which is exactly why relying on it so often fails us. What actually holds a life together long-term isn't a feeling. It's a small set of mindsets, quietly practiced, that make the right action feel less like a battle and more like something you simply do. So today, I want to walk you through 8 of those mindsets, the kind that don't ask you to feel motivated at all, just to think a little differently. And by the end, you'll understand why some people seem to move through life with so much less internal resistance than the rest of us. The first mindset is Kaizen. Continuous tiny improvement, so small it barely feels like effort at all. Not a dramatic overhaul, not a New Year's resolution, just 1% better today than yesterday, repeated without fanfare. A person practicing Kaizen doesn't decide to get disciplined all at once. They decide to make their bed one morning, and then just their bed the next, letting the habit widen slowly on its own terms. In the West, we tend to chase big transformations, the total life overhaul, the dramatic before and after. And when that big push inevitably runs out of steam, we call ourselves undisciplined, when really we just aimed at something too large to sustain. Behavioral scientists have found that tiny, repeated actions build neural pathways far more reliably than big bursts of effort ever do. The brain trusts what it's shown consistently, not what it's told once with enthusiasm. The second mindset is Ganbaru, to persevere, to keep showing up with quiet effort even when the outcome isn't guaranteed and no one's watching to notice. It's less about pushing hard in a single burst and more about the willingness to keep going through something ordinary and unglamorous day after day. In the West, effort is often tied tightly to results. We push hard because we expect a payoff, and when the payoff is slow to arrive, the effort quietly stops. Ganbaru asks something different, that you show up because showing up is simply what you do, independent of whether today feels rewarding. And there's a quiet psychological shift that happens when effort stops being conditional on outcome. It becomes identity instead of a bet, and identity is far harder to abandon than a bet that hasn't paid off yet. The third mindset is Hansei, honest self-reflection done without shame attached to it. At the end of a day, instead of either ignoring what went wrong or spiraling into self-criticism, Hansei asks a simpler question: what actually happened today, and what's one small adjustment worth making tomorrow? In the West, reflection often swings between two extremes. Either we avoid it because it feels like self-punishment, or we do it and it turns into a spiral of guilt that leaves us more discouraged than before. Hansei is neither. It's closer to the way a craftsman studies a mistake in their work, with curiosity, not judgment, because the goal was never to feel bad about it, only to notice it clearly enough to do better next time. And that distinction matters more than it seems, since researchers studying self-criticism have found that shame tends to shut down motivation, while calm, neutral reflection tends to sustain it. The fourth mindset is Mottainai, a sense of respectful regret at waste, not just of things, but of time, effort, and potential. It's the quiet discomfort of letting something valuable go unused, a skill left undeveloped, a good habit abandoned halfway, an hour spent on nothing at all. In the West, we tend to feel that kind of regret only in hindsight, usually much later, once the waste has already piled up into something harder to face. Mottainai works differently. It's a mindset practiced in the moment, a small internal check that notices waste as it's happening rather than after the fact. And that shift matters because catching a wasted hour today is far easier to correct than untangling a wasted year later. People who carry this mindset aren't harder on themselves, they're simply more awake to the cost of letting good things slip by unused. The fifth mindset is Shoshin, beginner's mind, the willingness to approach even familiar things as though you're encountering them for the first time, without the weight of assumption or boredom. It sounds almost paradoxical for a video about discipline, but Shoshin is what keeps discipline from curdling into resentment. A person who's made their bed for the 10,000th morning in a row can either do it on autopilot, resentful and disconnected, or do it with the same small attention as the very first time. In the West, mastery gets treated as a finish line. Once you're good at something, you stop paying attention to it. Shoshin refuses that finish line entirely, and researchers studying long-term motivation have found that tasks approached with fresh attention rather than autopilot are far less likely to be abandoned, simply because they never become boring enough to quit. And the sixth, and the one people resist the most, is called Ukeireru, acceptance, specifically the practice of accepting a difficult feeling or circumstance fully before trying to change it. Not resignation, not giving up, but a clear-eyed acknowledgement of what is actually true right now before any effort to improve it begins. In the West, we tend to skip straight to fixing. We want the discomfort gone immediately, and we often fight the feeling itself as hard as the problem it's pointing to. Ukeireru asks you to pause there first, to let the difficult thing be exactly as difficult as it is, without adding a second layer of resistance on top of it. And that matters more than it sounds, because psychologists have found that resisting an uncomfortable feeling tends to intensify it, while accepting it fully, however briefly, is often what finally allows a person to move past it instead of staying stuck fighting it. The seventh mindset is Ikigai, often mistranslated in the West as a passion and purpose chart, but in its plainer form, it simply means having a reason to get up in the morning, however small. It doesn't have to be a grand calling. For many people, it's tending a garden, keeping a shop running, or looking after grandchildren. In the West, we often tie a happy life to achievement, bigger goals, bigger milestones, the next thing to chase. Ikigai quietly sidesteps that entirely. It doesn't ask what you're building toward, it asks what makes today worth showing up for, on its own terms, with nothing further required to justify it. And that distinction turns out to matter for motivation more than most people expect. Psychologists studying long-term well-being have found that people anchored to a small, steady sense of purpose tend to stay far more consistent than people chasing distant, ever-moving goals. And the eighth mindset, saved for last because it's the one that quietly undoes almost every other habit on this list if it's missing, is wabi-sabi, the acceptance of imperfection as simply part of how things are, not a flaw to be corrected. A cracked teacup still used, a garden left slightly wild, a version of yourself that isn't finished yet and never fully will be. In the West, discipline often gets tangled with perfectionism, the belief that if you can't do something exactly right, it's barely worth doing at all. And that belief, more than laziness, is often what actually derails consistency, because a missed day turns into a week, and a week turns into quietly giving up altogether. Wabi-sabi refuses that all-or-nothing trap entirely. A day done imperfectly still counts. A habit resumed after a lapse was never actually broken, only paused. And once that pressure to be perfect quietly lifts, what's left underneath is something far more sustainable, effort you can actually keep making, because it was never contingent on getting it exactly right in the first place. So there it is. 8 mindsets, none of them requiring a single ounce of motivation, all of them quietly holding a disciplined life together instead. Kaizen keeps effort small enough to sustain. Ganbaru turns showing up into identity, not a bet on outcome. Hansei lets you learn from a day without shaming yourself for it. Mottainai catches waste in the moment before it piles into regret. Shoshin keeps even repeated habits from turning into resentment. Ukeireru softens resistance by accepting what's true before trying to change it. Ikigai gives you a reason to begin the day that doesn't depend on achievement. And wabi-sabi, underneath all of it, lets a day done imperfectly still count. None of this means effort disappears entirely, or that some mornings won't still feel harder than others. That's still true, and it always will be. But if you've spent years feeling like you simply lack discipline, it might not be a character flaw at all. It might just be that you were waiting for a feeling that was never designed to show up reliably in the first place. So tonight, pick one small thing. Not the biggest change you can imagine, just the smallest one. Make the bed, write one sentence, take one honest look at today without judging it. Let that be enough. Because a disciplined, happy life was never built by people who felt like it every single day. It was built by people who simply kept going, gently, imperfectly, one small mindset at a time. If this gave you something worth trying, there's more like it here, so don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.